Welcome to Think Quietly. In 2021, the European Court of Justice banned a paste, not a chemical weapon, not a drug, a paste that medieval peasants made from tree bark. They banned it because in one single location, hunters used it to catch 200,000 birds in a single year. That is not primitive, that is terrifying efficiency. And that paste is just number one on this list. Every technique you're about to see was developed by people with no science degree, no laboratory, and no modern tools. People who were simply too hungry to fail. Governments across 27 nations banned these methods. Conservation agencies fought against them for decades. And modern science, quietly, reluctantly confirmed they all work. This knowledge was not lost. It was buried on purpose. And today you are going to see exactly why.
The fish were
in 1215, when the barons of England forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, they demanded limits on royal power, protections for the church, and the removal of fish traps. Buried inside one of history's most important human rights documents was a clause about a wooden structure in a river. That is how dangerous the fish weir was. A fish weir was a V-shaped barrier of wooden stakes built across a river. Fish swimming upstream were funneled toward a narrow basket at the tip. Once inside, the current held them there. No boats, no nets, no ongoing human effort required. The trap ran itself. The scale was industrial. One estate in Gloucestershire contained 100 fish weirs on a single property. A coastal community in southern France documented consuming 90,000 eels annually using the same technology. A single Norwegian variant called a catus could yield 50 kilograms of fish in a single day. The Magna Carta clause changed nothing. Governments repeated the ban 9 separate times between 1370 and 1495. Each repetition meant the same thing. The previous ban had failed. The weirs were rebuilt. The fish kept disappearing. Modern fisheries science confirms why. A weir placed at a river choke point during spawning season does not just catch fish. It intercepts the entire reproductive capacity of that river. Medieval fishermen were not thinking about population biology. They were thinking about winter survival. The effect was the same. Today, the Salmon Fishery Act of 1861 bans fish weirs entirely in Britain. The irony is that conservation agencies now build fish weirs themselves, not to catch fish, but to count them. The structure medieval peasants invented to empty rivers is now used by scientists to save them. The design has not changed. And the forests of medieval England.
bird lime.
A holly tree into something more valuable than silver. The process took 3 weeks. First, you stripped the green outer bark and boiled it for 10 to 12 hours. Then, you buried it in damp soil for 2 weeks, letting it ferment. Finally, you pounded it into a thick paste and mixed it with nut oil over a fire. The result was called bird lime, and it was so sticky that a songbird landing on a treated branch could not escape. This sounds primitive. It sounds cruel. What it does not sound like is sophisticated. But consider what a 2020 study in Nigeria documented. At a single site using this technique, hunters captured up to 200,000 birds annually. The efficiency was so high that modern conservation groups classified it as an existential threat to migratory species. The medieval version worked on the same principle that scientists call high surface adhesion combined with low cohesive failure. In plain language, the bird lime stuck to feathers but not to itself. This meant a bird struggling to escape only spread the adhesive further across its body. Every movement made the trap more effective. Medieval fowlers understood this without knowing the chemistry. They knew exactly how thick to apply the paste. Too thin and birds could pull free. Too thick and the substance would congeal and lose its grip. They knew that different bark produced different results. Holly from Damascus was said to fail in cold weather. Spanish varieties had an unpleasant smell that warned birds away. Italian craftsmen added turpentine to make their bird lime waterproof. In March 2021, the European Court of Justice ruled that this technique violates the EU Birds Directive. France had been granting special permits, allowing hunters to capture up to 42,000 birds per year using lime sticks. The court ruled that no exemption could justify the method. The ban exists because the technique works, not despite it. When researchers from the Committee Against Bird Slaughter documented sites across the Mediterranean, they found catch rates of up to 5 birds per lime stick per day. Set 50 sticks across a dozen trees and you could capture more protein in a morning than a bow hunter might secure in a week. Medieval peasants facing starvation did not have the luxury of inefficient methods. What they created was a technology that modern scientists now describe as indiscriminate in its effectiveness. Those are the exact words used in the EU court ruling. The pit trap, Archaeologists in Norway uncovered a network of hunting pits that changed how we understand medieval resource management. The pits measured 4 meters by 7 meters. Some were several meters deep. Carbon dating revealed they had been in continuous use for over 2,000 years. One site at Rhodesman showed activity from 1800 BC through 1690 AD, but here is the remarkable discovery. Norwegian authorities had tried to ban these pits as early as the 16th century. The government issued restrictions. They sent officials to destroy the structures, and hunters kept rebuilding them. Why would medieval and early modern governments waste resources fighting holes in the ground? The answer lies in what happens when you understand animal migration patterns better than the animals themselves. These were not random excavations. Hunters built wooden fences stretching hundreds of meters, designed to funnel elk along natural travel corridors. The fences guided animals toward narrow passages where pits waited beneath coverings of branches and leaves. The sides were lined with planks or masonry, making escape impossible. Some pits featured sharpened stakes at the bottom. Others were designed to trap the animals' legs in a tapered construction, holding them alive until hunters arrived. Archaeologist Dmitry Makoj from the University of Ljubljana has studied similar structures across Europe. His research suggests that the catch from these stone funnels would have been too large for any single family to consume. His exact words were that such abundance almost certainly had a social dimension, including collective consumption and feasts that reinforced community ties. The Norwegian government finally succeeded in banning pit traps completely in 1860. The official reason given in historical records states that trapping elk in pits is an extremely effective hunting method, not that it was cruel, not that it was unsporting, that it worked too well. Modern wildlife management confirms this assessment. Pit traps exploit what biologists call the flight response cascade. When an ungulate encounters an obstacle while fleeing, its instinct is to jump, but the brain calculates jump distance based on visible gaps. A covered pit presents no visible gap, so the animal does not jump, it walks directly into the trap. Medieval hunters discovered this through observation. Modern science confirmed it through controlled studies of ungulate behavior. The conclusion is identical. The method works because it exploits biology that animals cannot override through learning. The crossbow. In 1139, Pope Innocent II convened the Second Lateran Council. Among the agenda items was a weapon that terrified the nobility of Europe, not because it failed in battle, but because it succeeded too well. The crossbow was banned for use against Christians. The penalty was excommunication, and the reason reveals something profound about medieval hunting that most history books ignore. A knight in full armor represented perhaps 20 years of training and equipment worth more than a village. The feudal system itself depended on the military superiority of armored cavalry. A peasant with a crossbow could kill that knight from 50 meters away with a week of practice. Modern ballistics research confirms what medieval nobles feared. Crossbows of the period generated draw weights between 300 and 600 pounds. The bolts could penetrate chainmail at close range and damage plate armor at medium distances. A 2024 analysis notes that the crossbow removed the protective advantage of mounted knights entirely. But this has implications beyond warfare. The same weapon that could pierce a knight's armor could drop a deer at ranges impossible for a longbow hunter to achieve reliably. The same ease of use that threatened aristocratic military dominance made the crossbow devastatingly effective for poaching. Consider the physics. A longbow requires years of training to develop the specific muscle groups needed for accurate shooting. English archers began training as children. The skeletal remains of medieval longbowmen show distinctive bone deformities from decades of practice. A crossbow requires pointing and triggering. The mechanical advantage does the work that human muscle cannot. For hunting, this meant something specific. A poacher with a crossbow could wait in concealment for hours without muscle fatigue, degrading their accuracy. Before tremor compromised the shot. This is why crossbow hunting regulations remain stricter than rifle regulations in many modern jurisdictions. The weapon is too effective for too little skill investment. The medieval church called it immoral because it required little courage and training. Modern wildlife managers call it efficient beyond what sustainable harvest permits. The language changes. The underlying recognition remains constant. When Richard the Lionheart used crossbows in the Crusades despite the papal ban, he was not being rebellious. He was being practical. The weapon worked. It worked in hunting. It worked in warfare. And every attempt to eliminate it failed because effectiveness creates its own momentum. Night hunting with fire. Imagine standing in a medieval forest after dark. You are in a bark canoe drifting silently down a stream. At the bow, a torch burns in an iron bracket, and along the banks, pairs of eyes begin to appear, frozen in the flickering light. This technique has different names across different cultures: fire hunting, torch hunting, lamping, shining, but the principle remains constant. When sudden bright light hits the eyes of a deer or similar prey animal, something happens in their nervous system. They freeze. Modern neuroscience calls this tonic immobility, a prey response that evolved when the primary predators hunted by movement detection. If a rabbit freezes when it sees a hawk's shadow, the hawk might lose track of it. This worked for millions of years. Then humans discovered fire. The technique appears in indigenous hunting traditions across North America, documented extensively in 18th and 19th century accounts. George Catlin painted Ojibwe hunters using this method in 1846. But the practice existed in medieval Europe as well, described in hunting manuals and later banned by forest laws, specifically because it was too effective for common people to possess. Here is the modern scientific validation. In 2019, researchers published a study in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, examining how light technology affected hunting efficiency. The results were stark. Hunters using powerful lights captured twice as much prey per hour as those hunting by daylight. The freezing response works on a neurological level that training cannot override. The study found that in regions where night hunting remained legal, the introduction of cheap LED flashlights triggered population crashes in target species. Where night hunting was already banned, the black market adoption of this technology remained minimal because enforcement was possible. Medieval authorities understood none of the neuroscience. What they understood was results. When peasants could harvest deer by torchlight from boats, the king's forests emptied faster than natural reproduction could replace. The bans that followed were not about animal welfare, they were about resource control, and they worked only as long as enforcement exceeded opportunity. Today, night hunting of deer is illegal in most jurisdictions worldwide. The official reasons cite animal welfare and public safety. The underlying reality is that the technique exploits a biological vulnerability, so fundamental that no amount of habituation helps the prey escape. The medieval peasant with a burning brand and a spear understood something that took science centuries to explain. Light paralyzes prey, and that paralysis makes hunting in darkness more efficient than hunting in
Chemical fumigation.
the warrens of medieval England. Rabbits lived in underground tunnel systems that could extend for dozens of meters. A hunter above ground might know exactly where the rabbits hid, but have no way to reach them. The tunnels were too narrow for dogs. Digging would take hours and alert every rabbit to flee through back exits. Medieval hunters solved this problem with chemistry they did not fully understand. The recipe appears in multiple historical sources: yellow, arsenic, sulfur. Mix these ingredients, form them into a ball, light the mixture, and drop it into a burrow entrance. The escaping rabbits run directly into waiting nets. This sounds like medieval superstition. It is actually applied toxicology. Arsenic trisulfide, when burned, releases both arsenic trioxide vapor and sulfur dioxide. The combination creates an irritant that makes the underground tunnels uninhabitable within seconds. Myrrh, which contains volatile resins, creates thick smoke that carries these compounds through the warren's branching passages. The rabbits have no choice but to flee toward fresh air, which means fleeing toward the surface, which means fleeing into the hunter's nets. Modern fumigation for rabbit control uses aluminum phosphide tablets that release phosphine gas. The principle is identical: create an underground environment so hostile that the animals must exit. The medieval version was actually more sophisticated in one respect. It drove rabbits out alive, allowing selective harvest. Modern fumigation simply kills everything below ground. Ferreting itself remains legal in much of Europe, including England and Wales. But the chemical fumigation techniques medieval poachers developed are now restricted under COSHH regulations. The control of substances hazardous to health. The arsenic compounds are classified as carcinogenic. The sulfur compounds damage respiratory tissue. Modern regulators restrict them not because they fail to flush rabbits, but because they expose handlers to toxic materials. The medieval warrener who dropped a smoking ball of arsenic and sulfur into a burrow was conducting chemical warfare against rodents, using principles that modern exterminators still apply. They did not know they were creating irritant gases. They knew that rabbits emerged when the smoke went in. Rabbit warrens in medieval England were serious business. Lords employed professional warreners at high wages to protect these valuable assets. Organized poaching gangs, sometimes led by members of the gentry, raided warrens and sold the meat and fur on black markets. The chemical smoke technique was one of the poachers' most effective tools because it required no expensive ferrets and produced results in minutes rather than hours. Medieval hunters developed a delivery system for chemical irritants that modern pest control has only refined, not replaced. The underlying science was sound. The ethics of exposing humans to arsenic fumes were not considered because no one understood the long-term effects. What they understood was that the smoke worked, and when something works in survival situations, it spreads. Medieval hunters had no biology degrees. They had survival pressure, generational observation, and the willingness to use whatever worked. We did not progress beyond their techniques. We banned them because they worked too well. If this video taught you something you did not know, subscribe to Think Quietly. Every week I uncover forgotten knowledge that history tried to erase. And if there is another lost method you want me to investigate, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one.